Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to Access and Privacy Online, the podcast where we delve into the latest issues, challenges, and advancements in access to information and privacy rights. I'm your host, Patrick Farnsworth. Today, we're thrilled to start the year with a look back at 2025 and look ahead to the rest of 2026 with FIPA President Mike Larsen and Executive Director Jason Woywada. Let's get into it.
So to start, I want to make sure we begin this podcast with getting your reactions, Patrick. And I really want to make sure, because you're the host of the podcast, you're looking at these stories that are flying across our desks every week. And some of our discussions off mic have focused on sort of the pace of that change, what you've been seeing, as well as all of these outlets that are doing a ton of access to information requests and informing stories.
Right.
So from what you've seen this year, what really stood out to you in some of that coverage?
I think what's really, I think it does take almost a year or so of just sort of going through every week of news and then just seeing it all summarized and then doing the script and the recordings and that to kind of get a broader sweep of just how news works, I guess, like kind of getting the sense of like something that really I like about doing this podcast is that we're focusing on like things that are happening on a municipal level, smaller towns across Canada. Also focusing on international news, of course. We do some pretty sweeping stuff there, but generally just seeing like how access to information, transparency, privacy issues manifest on this very local level and the kind of nitty gritty work that you can tell that goes into local reporting. It's just, sometimes it feels like, well, I think the general sense that we can get is like, well, we're only really paying attention to the larger stories, the national stories, what's happening on these sort of larger political parties and the details of those sometimes controversies or just what's happening on a policy level. But really a lot of this stuff, and that gets emphasized when we're sort of editorializing a little bit about it, but we're basically saying what's happening here in the city council is really important actually because citizens want access to this information of what's going on. And yet we often see a lot of resistance to that. There's obfuscation, there's ways in which that's being blocked on a kind of local level. And that's just as important because that affects people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And yeah, just the nature of the reporting on that. You see some of these journalists, these names that come up over and over and over again in our reporting and how we're doing these podcasts. And these people are just on the beat. They're doing it every week. And you can just tell that they understand the importance of it as well. But it really kind of feels good to do a podcast where we're really kind of summarizing some of their work, but also just giving, if you've been listening to it over the years, over the year now that we've been doing this, you'll just kind of notice that. I think you'll notice the labor that a lot of journalists put into their work. So yeah, I would just say that really comes across for me. And yeah, I just think that we do something kind of unique, which is really providing that sort of, not microscopic exactly, but we are really focusing on the nitty-gritty details of these local battles over transparency and governance, and then sort of expanding outward and saying, well, what's happening actually geopolitically? Like, how is the U.S. affecting Canadian politics and how they're responding to some of the belligerents or some of the more subtle things that are happening as well in the United States or in other parts of the world, in Europe and elsewhere. So I just think the scope of it is really kind of sinking in for me at the end of the year. And it's just really been developing quite well over this time that we've really been able to work out how to do this. So,
Well, and one of the things that struck me in our conversations prior to this was looking at those local journalism initiatives and considering what those outlets are doing, right? The ability to say quite definitively, like we're seeing great reporting coming out across Canada using access to information. We're seeing it, we're well familiar with Bob Mackin and the work that he does here in Vancouver and the Vancouver Sun and Check TV and how all the outlets in BC are doing that stuff. And now we're actually able to say, oh, wait a second, the Pointer in Ontario is doing some really incredible work with the GM plant and the environmental impacts there using access to information. Maggie McIntosh in the Winnipeg Free Press almost every week for the past 6 months has had access to information stories informed by a couple of key dynamics. The National Observer, all of these other outlets using local journalism initiative resources have really created an impact there that we're able to link to and draw from and then highlight in podcasts like this. And I think that's really important work that I'm glad the executive and the board are supportive of, and that the organization that we're a part of is able to sort of highlight with those things. And so, Mike, like when we're thinking about what FIPA did over the past year, all the deliverables and then all of the news stories outside of this that created headlines, what's most important to you?
Oh, there's tons of stuff. It's been a busy year. I think it's at the end of a year as you're kind of entering the new one. You're looking back and reflecting on just how much work the organization's done and how many things have been coming across our desks here. So I guess I'd start by just picking up where Patrick left off there and saying this year, this churn of stories that we've been summarizing through the podcast and speaking to really emphasizes to me how close to home access to information and privacy as domains, as rights actually are. And these, I mean, there's ways to talk about really interesting aspects of politics that don't seem as local, that don't seem as bread and butter for people. But when you start getting into transparency issues, the same challenges that we see, as we'll talk about, dealing with federal political parties. They come up at City Hall. They come up at local school board meetings, right? So these issues they cut across so many aspects of our lives, which I think gives this work a sense of vitality, right? Because it is connecting at all times with people's very intimate interests, right? Personal data protection is about who we are as data doubles, who we are as digital citizens, and transparency is about how we actually operate the levers of democracy. So this was a year that really highlighted how close to home these things were. But if I had to pick out some highlights this year of issues that really I think we came back to over and over again through our work, there's no way to talk about this year without talking about political privacy. And we were engaged with this, as listeners may know, well before the federal government introduced Bill C-4, which has potential for sweeping implications for this. Right, we were interested in the idea that citizens of Canada, and specifically British Columbia, because that's the jurisdiction we were working in, ought to have access to the information that political parties collect about them, because political parties collect vast amounts of this information. It's totally central to how politics operate these days. So we were already engaged in this. We were already engaged as interveners in court cases dealing with the applicability of British Columbia's Personal Information Protection Act to federal political parties that operate in BC. I think it's a good principles-based issue. I mean, I think people really understand that we need privacy rights in general, but particularly when it comes to politics and democracy, they're very important. And then, of course, we had the Bill C-4 drop. And we were talking earlier, just reflecting on, oh, yes, we had a federal election this year. I mean, it was just such a busy year. And that federal election brought forward, first off, it killed a bunch of bills that were on the order table that had some implications for information and privacy issues. But then there was a sweeping batch of legislation that was introduced, including this Bill C-4, which was ostensibly a economics and finance act that had a lot of implications for budget and economic policy, but that also embedded this end run around privacy rights that has this potential to essentially carve political parties out of privacy protections. And we were on that at a time when there was just so much going on. This is kind of a flood the zone type of practice here, right? There was so much going on that many organizations in the civil liberties field, many journalists were trying to figure out, okay, what are the core issues? I think one of the things I'm proud of this year is FIPA did a really good job of raising the Bill C-4 issue and trying to get that on the desks of as many people as possible to say, you have to look at this, because as we know, once it goes this direction, if that bill is passed as it's currently framed, it'll be very difficult for Canadians to claw back privacy rights vis-a-vis federal political parties. So I think it's a good fight, and it's one where I can see that we had an impact. That's a highlight for me. But how about you, Jason?
Yeah, I think this has all sort of been building because we've been spending a lot of time with the news monitoring and a whole bunch of other monitoring activities, so that building off of even 2024, like Alberta introduced that legislation and changes last year. We were able to intervene and raise the profile of those changes as quickly as possible. That's how we started 2025, was with an analysis of those Alberta changes. And it meant that when Nova Scotia did its end run on accountability by trying to, defang auditors and privacy commissioners, we could very quickly identify that jeopardy and raise the profile of those issues as well. Similarly, C4 is introduced, it hits our radar, we're able to very quickly respond and sort of address those things. And, this is playing out on levels at every level, I think, in a Canadian context. And I think that's the important thing that struck me with this, because it reminds me, all politics is local. So we see at the end of this year, Vancouver City Council putting in place this $10 fee to increase barriers to access information. And then you're hearing about these echoes at provincial levels, at federal levels with Bill C4 and Bill C2, and internationally with what we're seeing with AI legislation in the US, trans data flows of information across different, state and national lines. And it's all coming back to how much control we as individuals are afforded to our personal information and whether or not we have a right to do that in a modern society. And so, one of the key things that I've been encouraged by as well is that, as difficult as all of these discussions are, and as bleak as it may seem to some people, it's important to be optimistic and recognize that we have those rights. And we just have to make sure that our voices are heard, and we're continuing to work to make sure that we are protecting those rights in ways that we can, and by making those voices heard with MPs and other individuals. Those have been really important. I really enjoyed actually being able to talk to the commissioner twice this year in our commentaries, starting this year with a commentary with Commissioner Michael Harvey, where he was talking about, the call for privacy reform in British Columbia, and ending the year with a commentary from Michael Harvey talking about the importance of access to information to prevent disinformation and the spread of that. And so I think those were important commentaries and ability to do work there, to sort of highlight those issues and reground our work in those fundamental issues. There's been lots of research that we've done as well. And I mean, from your academic perspective, Mike, like how are we doing on that front?
Well, I think we're doing some really good core research that's of use to us, but also useful to many allies and partners in the field. I think that's one of the things that FIPA does well is we put out resources. They're very evidence-based. We show our work. We make them available to others in civil society who have stakes in issues around information and privacy rights. And I think we've done a good job with that this year. The research has been deep. It's been effective. It's been on a number of core issues. They may not be the flashy headline issues that sometimes come up and draw attention, but they build a base of knowledge. And this is one of the things that we're funded for. People expect us to help kind of build this base of knowledge. And we've done so in an innovative way this year. We'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't highlight the Access Assessments Project. I know it's something that's we're talking about elsewhere, of course, but the methodology for that was robust. We filed many dozens of FOI requests, followed through on them assiduously over multiple years, and we're able then, and of course there's still work ongoing, but we're able to point to some of the reasons that are often overlooked for why these systems don't work. Right. And I think that's an important thing for us to acknowledge, because when we're talking about transparency, we've testified before Parliament, we've made submissions to so many different committees, and there's a general consensus in the activist and advocacy communities that the transparency system in Canada is sometimes, we'll say, broken, certainly structurally flawed. It doesn't work as well as it should. There's lots of gaps. It's open to manipulation. So this is well known. What we were able to do this year, I think, is add a new perspective on why the system is not as functional as we would want it to be, as we have a right to expect it to be. And that's by looking at the ways that the guidance materials that are supposed to drive the doing of information management and transparency and right to know are inadequate to the task, that they leave a lot of gaps, that there's inconsistency built in, a lack of resources. That means that it's not a rights first approach to transparency. So we have that, and I'm excited because we're going to be going into the next year. We're going to be talking about information management and reviews of the Access to Information Act at the federal level. We'll be talking about law reform at the provincial level, and we have some new research, solidly research-based evidence to bring to these conversations about some major gaps that I think is should be persuasive to people who've been used to hearing the same arguments and same hypotheses for many years. So from a research perspective, I think we're doing some very exciting stuff. And we're always bringing in new voices and perspectives on this too. It's one of the things I really love about the way we've organized the research at FIPA is that we have a recurring cast of characters who are doing reviews and updates on our materials and doing new projects. But there is a diversity of different perspectives. It's not just certainly not just you and me and a core team of people. Is a breadth and depth of analysis there, which is great to see.
Yeah, and I want to make sure, I'm not forgetting anyone here, but we've Spencer's work with the access assessments was really important, and we can draw a direct line from the research that's been done by our University of Victoria Law Co-op students that have been placed here, and them expanding on each other's work, contributing to each other's work, reinterpreting each other's work, bringing that forward and updating it on an annual basis, so we can have, Jerica Katahata, doing the BC Special Committee on Democratic and Electoral Reform submission that is drawing from our foreign interference submission last year to sort of look at how access to information and privacy intersects the democratic process and our rights as citizens in elections, and highlighting access and privacy concerns in electoral processes at the provincial and national level, right? We've got Ryan Rutley and Gage Smith that have been working on our submissions around Bill C4 and our line by line analysis there, able to sort of really expand on each other's work, reinterpret it, resubmit it, make sure that it is accurate and up to date. And that's a big part of this is not just entrenching on a position because it's been what we've said in the past. It's making sure that we're reflecting modern legislation and the latest legislation and the latest court rulings and interpretations there as well, because that's important in all of these things. So that extended network of legal researchers that we've had coming into FIPA and that I really look forward to working with in the year ahead, I think has been really important. And I think we've got some great extended civil society groups in that network as well. And I know that you've been having a lot of conversations with them, Mike. Like, who do we want to make sure that we give appropriate kudos to there?
Well, I mean, there's tons of different groups that have been that are active, and I think one thing that some people would know, but people may not be aware of is how different the transparency and privacy fields are in Canada and around the world, right? I mean, just because of the way the law is organized, they overlap in some important ways. FIPA is like right in the middle of that Venn diagram, of course, because that's our mandate. But we find ourselves working with some groups that are, or individuals, even organizations that are very focused on transparency. Center for Free Expression has done in Toronto, out of Toronto Metropolitan University, has done some really good work. They, of course, every year offer the Code of Silence Award to political parties and governments and public bodies across Canada for failure to meet obligations around transparency. It's a good way to kind of draw people together to call out some gaps. But they're also really active in commenting on ways in which proposed steps to address things like online harms might curtail free expression, and that's a very important part of the conversation. FIPA's in BC, we've consistently for decades been partners closely with the BC Civil Liberties Association, and they take on some fantastic work in terms of law reform, legal advocacy, intervention in court cases, and also a lot of stuff around digital privacy and surveillance. And so they've been really important in that role too. And we always look to the Center for Law and Democracy on the East Coast in Nova Scotia for their attention to transparency on an international stage and kind of giving Canada almost a center of excellence hub for trying to analyze access to information comparatively around the world. And so I think, and increasingly we've gotten into relationships where we share ideas, share resources, share drafts, try and make sure that we are on the same page, and have a lot of conversations on an ongoing basis with these organizations and so many others, right? That's just a few. And that's an important part of the work. You can't do any of this kind of stuff in a silo.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things I want to make sure I can highlight here now is this growing relationship with ICLMG, the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and Tim McSorley out of Ottawa there. There's been some changes in their structure. We're members there, and we're going to be able to start publishing their work and highlighting it on our website and on our podcasts a little bit more systematically. Really excited about the opportunity to do that. And if there's other groups that are hearing this and are interested in that type of relationship as well, I encourage them to reach out to us and sort of get in contact so we can start doing more of that work together. I think there's a really solid opportunity when we work collaboratively to advance these issues. We see that in things like the ADA organizing committee that was structured with Cynthia Koo from Citizen Lab drafting a stellar letter that actually helped move the dial on some of these issues and advance privacy rights and privacy considerations as we're looking at these things, and helping to coordinate activities when we look at artificial intelligence in a Canadian perspective and what that's going to mean in the coming year. So I think, that the broader network of civil society that is coming together, given the risks associated with these programs and suites of software that are coming in, is important. And it's great to see everyone sort of coming together to recognizing that risk and threat to our rights and to the personal information of Canadians. So maybe that's enough time on 2025. Maybe we should take a look at 2026 at this point. So, where do we see things going there?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, sure.
I only can gesture towards I think something that's been sticking in my mind because it's been coming up in some of my other research that I do, mainly out of the US, but like kind of looking at how these laws that are coming up, it was mentioned in some of our recent rundowns, but like there was a recent legislation that just was enacted in Australia where they basically do a social media ban for, I think, 16 and under. We haven't really from how I've read the script, how it's been written, we haven't really gone into some of the implications of that because we're kind of just reporting the news on that. But I'm curious because this has been a trend across the board. We're seeing certain laws or forms of legislation and other things that are coming up in the U.S. in particular around this as well, ostensibly about children's safety online, which I think anyone would agree is an important issue. But it's often kind of couched in a lot of this moral panic, which is more of a cultural thing. And how the implications of that is not just for children, but for everyone online. So I'm kind of curious where that's going to go in the next year. It's somewhat of a complicated subject, but regardless, it is, dealing with privacy issues and age verification and all of this stuff. I'm really curious to see where that's going to go and how that's going to manifest in Canada, if it does at all. What's going to happen there, because obviously what's happening is governments are observing what's happening in other places and seeing what laws are being enacted there and creating their own versions of that in their own countries. And so that's something that I'm really just curious to see, that the direction that's going to go in particular. Yeah, and then, just some of the stuff that's really started in this past year and just spilling over into the next year, regarding these bills that we've been really focusing on in Canada. And so, yeah, that to me is just not super specific, but, just generally speaking, just seeing how these trends. And I think the fact that we're going to do this podcast and continue to do it at the pace that we're doing it allows us to kind of slow down and look at the details a little more. When anyone who's just sort of reading the news or listening to podcasts to get the news, it's a bit overwhelming. So I think having sources of information that are a little more measured and take the time to go over the details is going to be increasingly more valuable for the information consumer, the person who's analyzing this information. Just having sources that are measured and calm as things get increasingly more chaotic, seemingly.
Good points, Patrick. As someone who teaches courses on moral panic and media literacy, I'm happy to hear that mentioned. Yeah. And this is a true challenge, right? Because if you look at the expansion of surveillance powers that infringe on civil liberties and have increasingly intrusive capacities to gather personal information, quite often these are rationalized as measures necessary to protect young people, right? To address online harms, and particularly with an emphasis on youth. And indeed, pretty much every expansion of police powers, throughout the last 50 years is justified by a need to provide further protection for youth, including in terms of things like drugs and other domains like that. But the danger with that is that, of course, we do have this completely legitimate, very reasonable expectation that governments will play a fundamental role in protecting young people. Who doesn't want to protect youth? The challenge, of course, is that can short circuit serious conversations about this kind of creeping power of surveillance. And I'm really worried about that in the context of online harms. On the one hand, you have increasing exposure of young people to the most insidious forms of data collection, but also, serious online harms around things like deepfakes, the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is an area that I study. These are really serious harms, and there are very few checks and guardrails that prevent people from accessing that kind of content. So, something ought to be done. And then the question is, what is the something? And there's lots of ideas in play, everything ranging from social media bans, as we see in Australia, as we see kind of discussed in England as well and elsewhere, through to forms of verification, user verification, age verification, which would involve huge personal information collection, likely through third-party private sector platforms that I have absolutely zero confidence in being able to maintain, data security and protect personal privacy. So that is a landmine for personal privacy and also for freedom of expression, variety other things there too. And then there's also this idea, well, maybe we could address this by having greater responsibility for platforms, right? Maybe making sure that some of the places that host and produce and offer this kind of content bear some responsibility for harms associated with it, which I think actually is an idea that has lots of merit. But this year we've seen some of the limits of Canada's ability to hold non-Canadian platforms accountable for harms that are clearly in violation of Canadian laws. This goes back to, it goes back before this, but of course the Clearview AI case we see this with. We see this recently in British Columbia with efforts to hold social media platforms responsible for non-consensual distribution of intimate images online and running into limits of our ability to actually effectuate takedowns and banning of certain kinds of content. So this issue, right, of local jurisdiction to deal with very serious local harms in a globalized, borderless data world, where increasingly the kind of algorithmic media oligarchies are more powerful than many states. That is going to be a tough knot to untie. And I can see a lot of ways, as you mentioned, that's going to pop up in the year to come. I'm looking forward to it. And on a bright side, I always worry when we start to see calls for greater surveillance because of, won't somebody please think of the children? Because this is an old story that's been repeated many times with potentially some very serious implications. But that being said, I was really heartened, and I remain heartened as we go into 2026 by recent announcements by the federal and provincial information privacy commissioners across Canada about a renewed effort to really focus on youth and educational platforms, data privacy around that, and also around media literacy. Right, as something, and misinformation, right, as issues that are connected to our digital media landscape and our privacy rights. And so it's great to see those threads being gathered together. And I think there's some really potentially positive impacts that could come from that. I'll be keeping an eye on that as the year goes forward. And maybe one more thing before I turn it over to Jason here is, I teach as an educator. I teach an advanced course on surveillance and privacy issues. And one of the things I'm looking forward to doing in January is actually having my students check in on the podcast. As an educator, I'm looking at all these ways to ensure that I can bring students up to speed on information and privacy issues. And, these are issues that haven't really been owned by any disciplines, right? If you look at in Canada, anthropology, sociology, criminology, where I'm from, none of these really say, okay, information and privacy is our domain specifically. So you can do an advanced degree in any of these fields and really know quite little about information and privacy rights, which means my job is to give a pretty good crash course on the state of affairs, right, where things are right now. And there really is no better resource, to be honest, for doing that than saying, listen to our podcasts. We summarize, all the best stories, all the most important things that are taking place on a weekly and ongoing basis. So as an educational resource, there's no competition for that in the Canadian stage right now. And that's, I think, a good reason for a feather in your cap, Patrick, and for the team.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and I think as we're looking at known unknowns and there's going to be this whole dynamic of the election or elections this year, right? And things in 2026 that we aren't quite sure about, right? Like you get into this known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, and we don't know if there's going to be an election in BC.
Can I say I didn't know that you were going to be quoting Donald Rumsfeld in this podcast, but thank you for that.
It predates him, but you're welcome. It's come up a couple of times. Every once in a while, I get to drop it.
Yeah.
But yes, and it's always good to be aware of those types of comparisons. But yes, like BC's provincial election, a possible federal election in Canada again, a possible federal majority rather than a minority government. Like these are all dynamics that are going to be playing out on on the political scene here in Canada that have massive implications for access and privacy. And that's before we start considering Alberta succession. Or the discussion around that, because regardless of the Alberta succession debate, the Alberta legislative and legal frameworks have definitely been aligning more to a U.S. stance and position in terms of the implications to personal information and access to information from the state and from the province in that respect. And those have far-reaching implications across the rest of Canada if we see those changes echoed in other provinces and treated as aspirational rather than cautionary. Right. And so, what I've been finding fascinating is because of the monitoring that we're doing and the reporting on a weekly basis, you're able to see this play out in real time and on a week to week basis, look at how that legislation is coming in and how that's then echoed in other jurisdictions and who's drawing from what. And, I have to say, like, I've, I have, I have been looking at influencers and I come from a broadcast background. And so looking at how all of this plays out in the modern media framework, I've never been more appreciative of legitimate sources of information like mainstream media. Because you can turn to the Canadian press and you can turn to the major outlets and know that what you're getting is going to be a reporting of the facts. And it really speaks to how certain elements that are trying to drive propaganda and particular narratives will work to undermine legitimate sources of information, whether that be academia, whether that be mainstream media, and whether that be the government. And it's important, I think, that when I'm looking into 2026, that we continue to recognize the importance of civil society and what that means living in a community where we're all trying to get through as best we can, and keep making those changes. So there's a lot of things there I think that we can sink our teeth into. This Bill C4 is going to continue to be a major driver for us into 2026. I know that already. And then with these other elections that we're looking at, those are going to be major factors. And just the growing influence of AI and everywhere I've gone in the last 6 months, and I know Mike and I have been talking about this, data sovereignty is increasingly coming up and relevant to people because they want to be able to control their personal information. And governments are going to be remiss if they don't recognize that shift in public concept around this, because there is a general unease that is settling into Canada in terms of the US and how much information we store there, who has access to it, and why. And the US is no longer framed as an ally that is absolved of and always defaulted to. I don't think in a Canadian perspective, I view the US as any more safe for my personal information than Russia or China or other foreign powers at this point, based on where their information may be. And this has played out in a whole bunch of debates and ongoing discussions. And people have heard me make that comment before, and I will continue to raise it, that it is a false equivalency to say the US and China are the same. Absolutely. However, there are corresponding concerns in storing our data in either the US or China. And those need to be recognized. And that is an equivalent concern for Canadians, I think. And so that concern is grounded in fact. The respective threats and risks may be slightly different.
Yeah, I think the general trend, and obviously the U.S. has so much influence over, most particularly you're talking about data. Silicon Valley is obviously based where it is. And so many, I think now over the past year, just with the belligerence of the Trump administration, we are going to see more and more European, Canadian, other governments are trying to figure out how to decouple or how to untangle themselves more so they have more control over their data and the sense of privacy that comes with that. So that is an ongoing trend, and that is both positive but also extraordinarily complex, and we'll just see how that continues to unfold over the next year in 2026. There's so many points. We had a outline for this that was substantial. There's so many, again, the churn of information and stories that we focused on over the past year that FIPA did as an organization that worked on. So, there's so much, and I really just want to say thank you both, Mike and Jason, for coming on the podcast, for doing all the work that you do at FIPA and on the podcast, and just really thankful for the work that you both have done over the course of this year.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks. And it's great to start the year with a whole lot of thanks and gratitude, right? Like that's
Absolutely.
important. Wonderful way to start the year.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the podcast.
Cheers.
Access and Privacy Online reviews the headlines and delivers deeper commentary on a regular basis. Be sure to subscribe to get the full episodes every week and get notifications when we release show segments and other commentary throughout the week. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a good one.